an effective repair addendum, and ensuring expectations are met before closing. So you have 5 options in the OREF sale agreement for in the inspection contingency. The first is licensed professional inspections, and that's on the sale agreement form itself. The second is OREF 58, and that's the professional inspection addendum. The third is other inspection addendum, which you would have to draft. And then the 2 waivers, buyer's waiver of inspection contingency and buyer's waiver of inspection and inspection contingency both. And we'll talk about each of these. So essentially during the inspection contingency, it's the time for the buyer to determine the condition of the property. Hold on, I gotta grab my notes. To determine the condition of the property, identify any health and safety issues that they may be concerned with, to verify that the buyer can use the property for their intended use, and to determine if the purchase price accurately reflects the condition of the property and reflects the value of the property based on the property condition. So the first licensed professional inspections is on the sale agreement, and it's that checkbox right there. That is the one that I see most often. And it gives the buyer a default 10 business days to perform all of their inspections and complete any negotiations they have with the seller regarding any matters that are contained in the inspection report. The buyer is required on line 167 to identify any invasive inspections, and that includes mold, sewer scopes, radon, or any soil samples. So anything that includes testing or removal of any portion of the property. Radon, I never understand that because that's air, you're testing air, but anyway. The seller is not required to modify any terms of the sale agreement. The buyer must reach mutual agreement with the seller or provide unconditional disapproval by 5 p.m. on the 10th business day, if the 10 business days is what you've defaulted to. If no agreement is reached with the seller regarding any repairs or credit, the buyer gives notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval. They can do that anytime during the inspection period. And in that case, all earnest money is promptly refunded and the transaction terminated. If the buyer fails to provide that written notice of unconditional disapproval by 5 p.m. on the final day, the contingency will be deemed satisfied, and the buyer is proceeding to close on the property in as-is condition. Additionally, the transaction will terminate if written agreement is reached with the seller. Once written agreement is reached with the seller regarding repairs, the inspection period will automatically terminate unless the parties agree otherwise. So as a buyer's agent, it is really crucial that you watch your timeline. And as the 5 p.m. deadline approaches on the deadline day, you need to counsel your client that if they don't want to accept the property in as-is condition, they need to submit the unconditional disapproval. You also have the option of trying to negotiate an extension with them of the inspection period, but be aware that both parties have to sign off on that extension before the original 5 p.m. deadline. If you're using the OREF forms, the inspections must be conducted by a licensed professional, and otherwise the buyer can't leverage this contingency for termination. It doesn't allow, if you've checked the box for licensed professional inspections, it does not allow for personal inspections or for the buyer's best friend or his uncle who used to be a contractor to evaluate the property. You have to use a professional inspector. Based on that inspector's report, the buyer may be able to leverage the contingency and terminate.
I have a question.
I'm getting that weird echo thing again. I apologize. The buyer or the buyer's agent
Can you hear me?
should not provide any portion of the report to the listing agent unless it has been specifically requested. Note that there's new language that if a seller requests that all or any portion of the report be provided during the transaction, or within
Hey,
30
Angela, I
days,
think Matilda has a question.
the buyer
But
will
her
promptly
her
comply.
speaker's acting
So-
funny.
Termination does not release the buyer from the obligation to provide a copy of that inspection report. They have 30 days after termination that they need to provide it if it's requested. Note also that the buyer is responsible for restoring the property following any
Yeah, I'm putting
inspection.
headphones on to try to help my echo. One sec.
I'm sorry, Matilda, I can't hear you. Did you say
She's putting
something?
on headphones because she's got a question about I think about the licensed contractor requirement.
Okay. Okay, thank you. It's weird because I can only hear through the TV, but if I get any closer or I turn up my audio on my laptop, I get an echo. So I apologize. So the buyer is responsible for restoring the property following any inspections. So if the inspector has disturbed the property in any way, pulled boards off the siding to check for dry rot or moisture, he's moved insulation aside, whatever he's done, the buyer bears the responsibility for putting that property back to its pre-inspection state.
Yes.
An example of this is an inspector turning on a faucet in the upstairs bath and plugging the tub to check for leaks. The inspector forgets to turn it off. It floods the entire downstairs, damaging flooring and sheetrock. The buyer then doesn't want to buy the house because it's been damaged. Seller doesn't agree to all the terms of the termination because they aren't releasing the buyer from their obligation to restore the property back to its pre-inspection state. And keep in mind, the seller has no recourse against the inspector. The contract for the inspection is between the buyer and the inspector. That's who has a contractual agreement. So this happened at another Keller Williams office and resulted in a lot of litigation between the buyer and seller regarding the cost of restoring the property. So it is the buyer's responsibility. Typically, professional inspectors will take on that liability and their insurance will cover it, but there's always the odd case where they don't. Second option is the professional inspection addendum, and this is OREF 58, and it creates the same contingency as the first option, but it includes a list of inspections and tests that a buyer may want to have performed. And as much as I don't like an additional piece of paper, I like that this includes a list so that buyers are aware of the additional inspections that they may want to have done. It kind of gives them a clue, hopefully, that a professional home inspection is not an extensive look at all of these systems. It is an overview of the systems. And if they need additional inspections performed on the roof or the HVAC system, that those options are available to them. I don't
Angela?
all of the boxes, just saying it's your normal practice.
Hey, Angela.
Yeah,
Matilda has a question.
okay.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
I don't know why I have headphones on. How about now?
Well, I have to hear you through the TV screen and I don't know how to turn up the
Oh,
volume.
you know what? I'll type you up my questions when you're done.
No. Go ahead. I can hear you enough to answer your question. hopefully.
So earlier you were talking about how you can only use the inspection to help negotiate inspections and not, an uncle or whatever. But what if, which we do a lot, we get a contractor out to do a bid and we provide those bids to help us negotiate. Does it just need to be disclosed that way or?
Are the bids part of the client's professional home inspection. Remember, we're just talking about the inspection contingency, not about negotiating repairs. So if a buyer is
okay.
going to terminate a transaction based on the home inspection, according to the OREF forms, it needs to be, the inspection needs to be performed by a licensed professional home inspector.
Got it. Okay.
And
Thank you.
we'll get to how you can, you know, if buyers, you know, dad is a former contractor and he wants to have him take a look at the property, we'll get to that in a little bit, how you can do that.
Perfect. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, so OREF 58, again, just kind of an overview. I don't recommend checking all of the boxes and just telling your client, that's what I always do. If there's any dispute later, an attorney could construe that to mean that you'd never had a conversation with your client about the inspections or tests that were important to your client. Your buyer can certainly choose to check every box, but don't make it a standard business practice to define how your buyer is going to identify those tests that are important to them. The form OREF 58 also makes it clear that a buyer is not required to perform all of these inspections. It just says on line 6 that the land and dwelling may be inspected, and then they identify those inspections that are important. Other inspection contingency in addendum. On the OREF form, there's a checkbox for other inspection. And I'm going to skip the two waivers and come back to those, but I want to talk about this. And Matilda, this is kind of to your point. This option is pretty rarely used because it requires a broker to draft the entire language of the inspection contingency on a separate addendum, and there's no specific form for doing that. So it would be used if the buyer does not want to hire professionals to conduct the inspection, but they still want to personally inspect the property and potentially give their unconditional disapproval. What I recommend agents do if they are representing a buyer who doesn't want to hire a professional home inspector is use the language of the professional inspection contingency and just change that where it says professional inspection, change it to personal inspection, change that language. And by doing so, you're still building the contingency language that covers who's responsible, what the deadlines are, what the benefits are, and you get all of the contingency elements in place based on language that attorneys have drafted for the professional inspection form. Does that make sense?
You said using the OREF 58, you could do that. Where do we put personal instead of professional?
No, you have to draft a separate addendum.
Oh, and just copy and paste everything else from it except
Mhm.
changing out those
Yeah.
words. Perfect.
Yeah, use the language from the sale agreement where it's got the professional inspection addendum language in the sale agreement and just replace professional inspection with personal inspection on your addendum. Okay, let's talk about waivers. One of the checkboxes is the buyer's waiver of inspections and inspection contingency. And essentially, the buyer is representing to the seller and to you as their agent that they are fully satisfied with the condition of the property, all systems, all elements, and they are knowingly and voluntarily waiving the inspection contingency and the right to have any inspections. This decision is solely their own. It is solely at their own risk. And we require a separate KW form just because we want to protect the brokerage and make sure that buyers understand that we're recommending they have an inspection. They're choosing to waive it for whatever reason. And this is a copy of the waiver of tests and inspections form.
I need a copy.
It's in command. I think if you click on the underlined button, I think this one comes up. If not, shoot me an email or a text and I'll remember to send it to you.
Thank you.
You can use this form for anything. We've all seen inspection agreements where the inspector says, recommend licensed and bonded HVAC professional inspect the HVAC system. And how many times do we actually get another licensed and bonded inspector in there or contractor to perform that separate inspection? It's most of the time we just go with the inspection report that we have. But if you really wanted to build in a layer of protection for yourself, you could put down HVAC inspection under buyer electing to waive following tests or inspections. Buyer electing to waive roof inspection. I mean, there are millions of systems, and inspectors will always say, recommend the buyer have that separate system inspected by a licensed and bonded contractor. So this is a risk reduction liability tool. And anytime your buyer is waiving inspections, I require that you provide this form so that I know that they have the right to have inspections and they're knowingly waiving it. The next option is the buyer waiving the inspection and the inspection contingency. So they are giving up their right to provide unconditional disapproval of any inspection. They're giving up their right to terminate based on the findings of any inspection. And they're saying that they're fully satisfied with the condition of the property, all elements, systems, everything. And again, they are knowingly and voluntarily electing to waive the inspection contingency. Whatever reason your buyer has for waiving inspections and the inspection contingency, the standard of care for you as an agent is to always recommend that they perform professional home inspections. Even with new construction, brokers will occasionally say, well, it's new construction and the buyer is going to do a walkthrough with the builder at 11 months and correct any deficiencies. So why would we pay for a home inspection up front? When I was at Portland West, Pauline Gordon used to tell a story about a principal broker whose husband was a builder and built her dream home for her. And on moving day, they move in, they get moved in, unpacked, and she decides to draw a bath in her luxurious master bath in the main giant jetted tub that he had put in for her. She enjoys her tub, and when she gets out, something doesn't sound right. And what had happened was the subcontractors had forgotten to connect the drain line to the waste line. So all of the water in that giant tub drained into the crawl space. Because there are so many subcontractors involved in home construction, it's always wise for a buyer to have an inspection. A contractor can't know and doesn't know every step that his subcontractors have taken on the home. So I can't emphasize this enough. If you have a buyer who's buying new construction, it's worth it to get the inspection. I represented a buyer on a new construction, and it was during the summer, and we discovered during the inspection that none of the heat ducts had been connected in the crawl space. So they wouldn't have discovered that until winter, when they had a really nice warm crawl space and no heat in the house. So an additional piece of advice is on new construction. I always tell my clients to get a sewer scope, just because if they're in an area where there's been a lot of new construction, it's not unusual for heavy equipment to crush the sewer lines. And I've had numerous instances where we've had to have sewer lines repaired on new construction just because they were crushed by you know, the heavy equipment building the home next to theirs. One thing to note is that the home inspection contingency is completely independent of well and septic inspections described on those separate forms. They have separate timelines, they're separate contingencies, and they are completely independent of your professional home inspection. There's a broad property inspection category on the sale agreement. There is another category for private wells and septic inspection. And it states in bold letters on the sale agreement that the selection regarding professional home inspections does not apply to OREF 81, the septic on-site sewage system, or OREF 82 private well addendum, if those forms are attached. So even if a buyer is waiving their professional home inspection contingency, they may not be waiving their septic and private well contingencies, as long as those addenda are incorporated into the sale agreement by checking the yes lines on those appropriate forms on the sale agreement. So we talked about waiver. The waiver form can be used during any of the options that where you've created a home inspection contingency. So again, if you've recommended a sewer scope and your buyer chooses not to have that done, they can sign the waiver saying that they're not having a sewer scope, not doing radon test, whatever. You can use that form during the professional inspection just as a follow-up on other tests or inspections. After the home inspection, you as an agent should be reviewing the report with your buyer. And anytime there is further evaluation recommended by the home inspector, ask the question of the buyer. Would you like to have that further evaluated? Should we contact an electrician? Should we contact a roofer? Whatever specialized contractor has been recommended. If they choose not to do so, then pull that form out and get it signed. It's not uncommon for buyers down the road to say something like, I didn't realize I needed to hire multiple inspectors. I thought that we had a home inspection. So the waiver, again, good risk reduction tool, good way to manage your risk. I see a lot of these come back a couple of years later, when, especially after the last couple of years, buyers were waiving the home inspection contingency just to get in the home, and competing with multiple offers. That was something that they were waiving. 2 years down the road, they discover the roof leaks. Well, the seller didn't say anything about the roof leaking in the seller's property disclosure. And you didn't tell me I could have a roof inspection. You told me I could have home inspection, but you didn't tell me I could have a roof inspection. So again, if you can pull out this form, you're a little bit more protected. The biggest area of disappointment for buyers occurs during the home inspection. Particularly first-time home buyers don't know what to expect. They don't know what their rights are, and sellers don't know what to expect. So one of the biggest challenge is managing expectations all around. Buyers will buy new construction and they expect it to be perfect. Or they'll buy a 1940s home and they expect it to meet the standards of new construction. So when buyers don't hear from you regarding the inspection, they either assume everything is fine, you've got it all handled, everything's good, or they assume the sky is falling and everything's falling apart. And believe me, when it does fall apart, that's going to be your responsibility. They're going to blame you. So if you are a buyer's agent, it is great practice to have some kind of an informational page or an email template about the inspection contingency and send that to the buyer as soon as you've reached mutual acceptance. Explain that selecting inspectors is solely their choice offer to provide them recommendations if they don't know who to hire. Encourage them to check the CCB website before they hire anyone. I always insist that my buyer or, mom, dad, husband, brother, somebody, their representative, be present at the inspection. If they can't be there for the whole time, I recommend that they come for the last 30, 45 minutes so that the inspector can give them a summary. Remind them what the purpose is. It's to verify that there are no major issues that they're willing to inherit, and that the purchase price that they agreed on accurately reflects the value and condition of the property. It's also their time to research school boundaries, property square footage, permits, any remodeling that was done, all of those things. Does this property satisfy their expectations of what the condition of the property is and what its uses are? I apologize for my sniffles. I also recommend having an information email for the listing broker, for the seller's agent, and receive confirmation when you schedule the inspection before you show up. Remind the listing broker that the buyer's inspector is going to need to access the crawl space, the attic, the electrical panel. Request that the seller not be there during the inspection. That's always a little bit touchy. Ask if the seller wants copies of the inspection report, and I would do that in an email and get their answer in an email or a text. Ask if they want to be notified when the inspection is complete and you've left the property. And if you haven't received them, ask for the seller property disclosures. Reassure your buyer that the inspector is going to be providing a written report, and that based on the home inspection and your presence there and that report, you're going to be reviewing all of the findings with them so that you can draft a repair addendum. I apologize for sniffly. One of the common misconceptions about home inspections is that it's some kind of a pass-fail. I had a buyer who could never grasp that the home inspector was not going to tell her that the house failed inspection. And it was up to her, acting with my advice, to leverage the inspection contingency to either have the seller make repairs or give her a credit, so that the purchase price accurately reflected that condition. If we could not leverage the contingency to get repairs done or get a credit, then it was up to us to provide that unconditional disapproval. Her response throughout the inspection was, they have to fix this because it won't pass inspection if they don't. It doesn't pass inspection. It doesn't fail inspection. It's informational. So continue to remind them of that deadline and keep that in mind. If you are a listing agent, I would have an informational email for the buyer's broker about the seller's, about their scheduled inspections. Confirm the date and time with them. Notify them not to send any inspection reports unless you requested them in writing, and request that they notify you when they are done. Hold on, let me look at my notes. One thing that has come up in recent months is cameras and recording devices. I always counsel my clients that the seller may have cameras or recording devices present in the house, and I would discourage them from talking about anything found during the inspection until we're out of the house. It avoids disclosure issues. Now we have that nifty little OREF form advisory about cameras and recording devices. So that's kind of a nice, a nice way to remind them. If you represent the seller, you also want to remind them, obviously, to remove any valuables, remove medications or weapons for safety purposes. Remind the seller of the deadline to complete the inspections. And if you represent the seller, ensure that they are going to be available for negotiations during the inspection period. We've probably all had sellers who chose the inspection period as the time to leave town and they're out of the country and you can't reach them to negotiate anything. So manage that expectation up front by ensuring that they'll be in contact during the inspection period. If you represent a seller, let them know that the buyer has the right to have multiple inspections over the course of several days, 10 days, if that's your default date. If it isn't explained to them, some sellers get very agitated and very frustrated when a buyer wants to come back to the property multiple times for different inspections. Let your seller know that it may happen, and that way you've managed the expectation up front and they're less likely to get as frustrated, and that frustration won't spill over into your negotiations. If you represent both the buyer and seller, I recommend that you have a conversation with your seller about whether they want you present during the inspection, and if they want to receive a copy of the inspection report. That becomes an issue as far as disclosing potential property defects. If you know of them, you have to disclose them. So if you learn of them during the inspection, they have to be disclosed to subsequent buyers. So if this particular transaction fails and your client has to fill out a new set of property disclosures, you have to disclose what you know about the property as well. When it comes to referring inspectors for your buyers, I recommend giving them at least 3 names. I also recommend avoid referring to the inspectors as my inspector. And we do that without even really thinking about it. We say, my inspector can, pop over there at 3 o'clock tomorrow and take a look at it. Or my inspector thought the roof looked fine. When you use that kind of language, what you're really doing is connecting the inspector and you in the buyer's mind. You are just as responsible for the work the inspector does because they're your inspector. And it implies some sort of agreement between you. So I would avoid using the phrase my inspector. You also want to encourage the buyer to verify that anyone they hire is licensed and bonded. So inspection day. If at all possible, I recommend that you're present with your client at the home inspection. If you can't be there, I would suggest having another broker from the office present so that they can open the property, secure it after the inspection, all of that. Make sure that your client asks the inspector any questions that they have during the inspection while they're at the property. Make a note of any recommendations for any further evaluation that the inspector suggests or recommends, and then ensure that the property is secure once the inspection is complete. And that goes back to the bathtub story. Make sure that the bathtub is turned off. Make sure all the lights are off, or however the property was when you got there. Return it to its pre-inspection state. Review the report with your buyer so that you can determine what their concerns are. You can identify any further evaluations that the home inspector has recommended, and you can ask the buyer directly if they want to schedule those. If they elect not to schedule any further evaluations, then have them sign that waiver of tests or inspections form just to protect yourself. When you review the reports, again, you've reminded your client that they're going to get a written report. And with first-time homebuyers especially, I would always tell them, because the buyer's remorse is going to set in when they see that report and the inspector has pointed out every little thing that is wrong with the house. And all of a sudden, your first-time homebuyers especially are surprised that that house is even still standing, given all of the things that are wrong with it. So I would always counsel my clients, this report is going to detail every potential area of concern. It's our job to go through there and define those things that are safety and health related, things that are broken and need immediate attention, things that are cosmetic or worn so that we can negotiate a credit for those or repairs for those. The seller does not have to do anything, but keep in mind, Mr. and Ms. Buyer, you're well-qualified buyers, and we want this house to accurately, the purchase price to accurately reflect the condition of the house. So one way to do that is to get any additional bids that we need for specific repairs. And that's helpful if we end up just negotiating a credit. It's important for the buyer to have an understanding of the dollar value associated with the repairs that they're requesting. Once your buyers have identified the repairs they're most concerned with, I would have a negotiation strategy with them before I write up a repair addendum, just to be sure that I haven't missed anything that's important to them, and to be sure that we're not being unreasonable in our requests. I'm sure we've all gotten those repair addendums, and literally the agent took the entire summary of the report and requested that every single thing be repaired, even down to the cracked outlet cover in the third bedroom that nobody ever uses. So you kind of have a lot of control over the process of repair negotiations by being reasonable and dealing with health and safety first and broken items next, and then moving on to things that are cosmetic. If you are, I got behind on my little slides here. If your buyer is requesting a credit, make sure that they have room to request that credit toward closing costs, because that keeps the money in their pocket. That's probably the most ideal resolution for the inspection contingency. It gives them more funds to hire contractors and to ensure that the work is done to their satisfaction. Whereas a price reduction does not do that. It doesn't keep any money in their pocket. It does in the long run, but not in the short term. It also, if you're reducing purchase price, that can affect lender docs, and that's more paperwork for you. So always make sure they've got, talk with your lender, make sure they've got a little additional room in the in their closing costs. If you're not able to negotiate a credit, then you have to draft your repair addendum. Make it as clear and detailed as you can and outline the full scope of the work that you're recommending. This is where those extra bids and estimates come into play. If you've got an area, let's say you've got dry rot on a side on siding, and all you put in your repair addendum is that the seller will replace or repair the dry rot on the siding, you haven't really identified the source of that dry rot. Is there an underlying leak? Is there water underneath the siding? Is there some kind of drainage issue that needs to be taken care of? So again, that is where getting those additional estimates can really come in handy. And it's good for your clients to understand that you're you're getting those for that reason. You're protecting their investment. I recommend using the OREF buyer repair addendum so that you can be sure that the seller is using licensed and bonded contractors. And that also gives your buyer the opportunity to re-inspect the repairs that they've negotiated prior to closing. So very important. Just a kind of a little side note. The repair addendum as it's written does not create any contingency that the seller has to satisfy or that the parties can waive before closing can occur. So if you simply say seller to, repair leak in master bath, seller to replace the roof, all that does, if the seller doesn't do it, closing can still occur. Escrow can still close the transaction. So what I recommend is a simple statement, creating a contingency saying closing is contingent on seller making the following repairs. That way you're making closing of the transaction contingent on those repairs. You've created a contingency and that protects your buyer. If your buyer, it will only close if the seller has completed those repairs. You need to make it a contingency of closing. Additionally, the OREF repair addendum specifies a date by which the seller must complete the repairs, and it provide proof written notice of those repairs. It doesn't just say, text us when you're done with the repairs. I recommend the OREF notice of completion of repairs form, OREF 23, to give that written notice. And that's what triggers the buyer's 2-day reinspection period. The default is 2 business days. Notice that your buyer doesn't get to complete another whole home inspection or negotiate any additional repairs. They are only evaluating the repairs that were agreed on during the inspection contingency. So they don't get to go back in and take a look at the mold in the attic or make sure the roof isn't leaking now. They can re-inspect only the repairs that they negotiated. This is the notice of completion of repairs or corrective action. This is where the seller is giving notice and the buyer is acknowledging receipt of that notice, and that's what triggers their getting notice of the completion of repairs is what triggers their 2-day reinspection period. I strongly suggest avoiding negotiating repairs being completed after closing. Once the transaction closes, your buyer has lost all leverage to ensure that the seller completes the work and that the work is done correctly. If it's absolutely necessary because of timing or you can't get contractors to do it, consider an escrow holdback, or consider having the check made at closing to the contractor. And then escrow gives that check to the buyer schedules the work and it gets done. Again, deadlines matter. You have to keep close track of your deadlines. Avoid submitting an extensive repair addendum, with hours until your deadline in your inspection period is run. We've all received them. They're annoying. They do nothing to move the transaction forward and to keep things on an even keel. And all it does is it annoys the seller, frustrates them, annoys the other agent, and it creates a contentious atmosphere that doesn't lend itself well to negotiations. So I would avoid that at all costs. You also want to keep your communication as neutral as possible. If you're the listing agent, don't speak for your clients and don't communicate how you think they'll respond. Don't tell the buyer's agent, well, this is really going to piss them off. I don't think they'll do any of this. Thank the buyer's agent for sending it over and let them know you'll present it to the seller. We're obligated to submit all offers, counteroffers, addendum objectively. So we have an obligation to present it as objectively as possible. I had a listing agent call, and we've all gotten this call. How did the inspection go? Well, my client had some concerns about the deck leaning. What? My clients had a pre-inspection and it didn't mention anything about the deck. There's no way they're going to fix anything related to the deck. That's not even an issue. Well, I never sent that request. And what you just did was you shut down any negotiation that we could have had about the repairs. So again, it's really important to be as neutral as possible. Thank you for submitting your repair addendum. I'll present it to the sellers and we'll see what we can do. That's it. Likewise, when agents ask, how did the inspection go? I'm typically pretty neutral. I may ask if they have a preference for a credit over doing the repairs, but I don't give up any room for negotiations. So I will simply say, I'm going to review the report with my clients and we'll make some decisions. That's it. Again, that 5 p.m. deadline. If you're coming up on deadline day and you've not reached any agreement on negotiations or on repairs, remember that the addendum to extend your deadline has to be signed by both parties by 5 p.m. on the last day of your inspection period. Super important for your buyers to understand this. They may think that they've got additional time to negotiate repairs. So it's really imperative that if they don't agree on repairs or they don't extend the deadline, they're accepting the property in as-is condition. If they terminate after that point, they're placing their earnest money at risk, obviously. So your buyer has a couple of options. They can either accept the property in as-is condition, provide notice of unconditional disapproval based on the inspections, and they can terminate the transaction, or they can negotiate repairs. Those are the three options. This is the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval, and notice that your buyer has to sign it. They changed this form this year, and now the seller has to acknowledge or supposed to acknowledge receiving a copy of it. A lot of times agents just don't, but they're supposed to. If you receive it, go ahead and just acknowledge it. I mean, that's kind of silly to not. So if you use the OREF repair addendum, the seller has a deadline to have those repairs completed by licensed and bonded contractors. You can also write in there that the seller will complete, XYZ repair themselves without using a licensed and bonded contractor. If your client if the seller works for a HVAC company, I think that he's probably perfectly qualified to replace the filters and clean the furnace. But that's a decision that your buyer needs to make. You don't make it for them. The responsibility for the repairs is on the seller and not you, not the agents. The agents are not doing the work. And if you're recommending service providers, again, give at least 3 names and encourage the seller to check their license status with CCB. We want our clients to appreciate the value that we bring to the table, but hiring the contractors and being the point person for those adds you to a liability mix that you neither want to be a part of or need to be a part of. Your value comes from guiding your clients through the process of the inspection, not in doing the work or contacting contractors to have work performed. So, best practice for listing agents. After repairs have been negotiated, if you're the listing agent, confirm with your client that they've lined up contractors, find out who those contractors are before the work begins, and stay in touch with them daily while the work is being performed. If the work isn't going to be completed by the deadline identified on your repair addendum, you need to initiate an addendum to extend that completion date. And once the seller reports that all the work has been completed, you need to get copies of the final invoices and confirm that the scope of the work addressed all of the repairs addressed on the repair addendum. Deliver to the buyer's agent the OREF notice of completion, along with the final invoices and any warranties, and that again starts their clock on reinspection. Yeah, I jumped too far ahead. If you're the buyer's agent, remember your reinspection is limited only to the negotiated repairs, and it's not an opportunity for the buyer to call out new items that haven't been previously negotiated. I would also provide the inspector with a copy of the repair addendum so they know what was agreed on, and when they go out to reinspect, they're not looking at other things. They're only looking at those things identified on the repair addendum. Couple of notes about new construction and the home inspection addendum. This sets out a totally different timeline for repairs, as well as what repairs are being triggered. The contingency timeline is triggered by written notice of issuance of the certificate of completion or certificate of occupancy. And the default is 10 business days to provide the seller with a punch list. According to the new home inspection, new construction professional home inspection addendum, habitability issues are always addressed first. And if the seller builder cannot complete those repairs by the closing date, the form allows for an additional default 7-day closing extension. If the buyer does not provide a punch list by 5 p.m. on the last day of the inspection period, that 10 business days, then they are deemed to have accepted the condition. And that's much like the regular home inspection addendum. So you've got to watch for that certificate of completion, certificate of occupancy, because that starts your timeline. The form doesn't really address what habitability issues are. For some clients, the presence of mold in the attic is a habitability issue. And that's something that has to be negotiated. So even though it says habitability issues addressed first, and those are of primary importance, it doesn't really define what those are. So you need to be tuned in with your client to what's important to them. I think that is all. Dun, dun, dun. That's
I have
all.
a question.
Okay.
That was great information. So the well and septic addendums, how do you properly, because I was told maybe yesterday I was doing it incorrectly, but if the buyer wants to waive the purity, if they just, what's the proper way of doing that? Or
If the
compliant
buyer-
waive?
They can,
parties
it's state
cannot
law.
The parties cannot waive the purity testing. That's a seller's obligation. It doesn't matter whether it's important to the buyer or not. That has to take place.
So what if they
So-
had results? So what if they had results, from 3 weeks ago and they accepted those results?
That's fine. I think they're good
Oh,
for 6
okay.
months.
Yeah, and some of them are different, 3 months, 6 months, but okay, so as long as something is provided, you don't have to do any new kind if they accepted what you already had on file because it was recent.
Right, right.
Okay,
And you would be listing that on the private well addendum where it says, copies of any reports, you would be listing prior testing report. And you would be attaching it to that addendum so that your buyer knows that you've already got it.
yeah, as an exhibit or something. Okay,
Right.
okay.
Anything else?
Community, obviously it's disclosed in the
Community one.
listing. Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
there's a way we do it now, but I'm just trying to think of, what's your best way of doing it as far as staying within compliance and to see if we need to improve,
Community
yeah.
wells, if they serve, and I truly can't remember if it's 3 households or 6 households, are not subject, they're not private wells, so they're not subject to the same seller testing requirements. Because
Correct.
the community
Yeah.
well operator has to comply with the state law and provide them water quality test results on a regular basis. So
Yep.
I'll double check how many households it has to serve to be considered a community well and not be subject to the private well addendum.
So we have it quite often, or even though we put that it's on a community well, and then we put the information as far as which one it is and their website so they can see, because they do monthly results. We'll still get a well addendum. And then I have to tell them that does not apply because they'll have an irrigation well. But I mean, that's not domestic, that's not the domestic water. And then I'll, just counter with that it's the domestic water is with the so-and-so Lucky Community Water District. Here's the information and samples are supplied to the owners, whenever it is. And then I send that all and usually with an exhibit, but yeah, okay. So that's all you can really do. I didn't know if there was some
it's the
special.
process of educating, because a lot of agents have never been exposed to community wells, and they think every well has to be tested, even if it's just for irrigation. So it's a process of educating your co-op broker so that they're aware of what the requirements are.
Okay, well, that's news to me that about that you have to do the testing, even if they wrote in their offer that they're waiving the sellers having to perform a purity
They can.
test.
They
Oh.
can. If you look at the state law, and if you actually read that form, it's kind of amazing what the requirements are on the seller and you as an agent, as far as reporting the well location and the well test results to the state. It simply cannot be waived. It is not something that a seller can just say, we're not going to do.
Okay.
They can negotiate how it's going to be paid for, but the seller has to comply with the law and it has to be tested.
Got it. Okay.
Ryan,
awesome.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I've got a question, and it's come up a few times where there's, inspection identifies some things that, of course, they always put, should be investigated further by an XYZ professional. But some of those are going to be very invasive. You have to, in order to start repairing stuff, or in order to really see what's there, it needs to be open fully. And so there's no real way to know exactly what we're going to find behind there or see. And so it's really hard to be specific on a repair addendum about what needs to be repaired. Do you have tips or strategies for negotiating things that really can't be seen without starting to rip things apart?
What I suggest people do is start with your sale agreement and where you check, where you identify invasive inspections, put radon, sewer scope, and any recommended by professional home inspector. And that way you've set the expectation that you may need to inspect other things that you don't know about yet. Once you've done that, a lot of it comes to your strategy for dealing with the other broker. They need to understand, you know, we want to have more testing done because these came up as issues during the home inspection, and we want to be sure that we're not asking your client to perform repairs that aren't needed, but we want to be sure that we're getting all of our questions answered about the condition of the property. So it's, you know, it's one of those issues where a lot of tact goes a long way. But if you've identified any additional inspections that are recommended by a professional home inspector, any agent would be hard pressed to tell you that you can't do that, get that additional inspection done, or get those estimates outlining the full scope of the work to be done. Does that help?
That is helpful. I mean, obviously it's about communication, right? And just explaining what the concern is and, you know, the only opportunities. I do usually write in that. I don't put professional inspector, I should, but I put any that the inspector recommends basically, or something along those lines on that line for invasive inspections.
Yeah, I think that's,
but really
that's
the
right.
owner, yeah. Okay. All right. Well,
it's like everything. You don't know what the seller's agent is telling them about the inspection. So all you can do is provide them the information and hope that it's getting relayed accurately. And that's why telling your sellers up front, you know, the buyer has this 10 business day period to perform any inspections they want. And they're not intentionally trying to aggravate you by requesting additional inspections. But we want them to be as sure about the house they're buying so that this transaction doesn't fall apart during the inspection period. We want to be sure that they are well-qualified buyers, which we've done. And we want to be sure that they are buying the property knowing its current condition. It's, you know, like anything, it's how you present it. You want to present it as a benefit to them for the buyers to do their full inspections.
right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm trying to think of any other questions that I have. This is going to be recorded so we can share it with some other team members, correct?
Yes, it is recorded. And I typically do this once a year, just because I think it's helpful, especially for new agents. I know like Tessa came to last year's class. And it is, I know Corinne is recording it. And if you have any questions, obviously email me, call me, text me, whatever.
Can we have the slides, Angela?
Yeah, I can send you the slides. You bet.
Yay. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the class. That was great.
You betcha.
Okay. Have a great
Anything else?
day.
You bet. Thanks. I will get your CE certificates out probably not until Monday, but look for them in your email.
Okay. I'm not, I had to leave for 15 minutes or something for a phone call, 10 minutes. So I don't know
And
if
I literally left for 2
10
minutes because Paul kept
I
calling
don't
me.
know anything about that.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry.
Anyway.
What?
it's okay. I'm not that worried about CE because
Yeah,
I've got to
same-
do the
same
advanced
thing.
practices.
That's
So
that's a
don't worry
bonus.
about sending me a certificate.
No, I will send it anyway. You know, free CE credits are, I'm all about that. And I'm sure that anything you missed, you'll be able to pick up in the slides. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Angela, so much.
You betcha. I think we are done. Thanks you guys for being here, and we will talk to you later.
Thank you, Angela. Bye.
Thanks, Matilda.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Sorry about that.